San Francisco is a city in the state of California, on the west coast of the USA. It's very popular with tourists. They come to see its steep hills, its old trams, and to visit the infamous prison on Alcatraz Island. Nobody ever escaped from Alcatraz alive. The city is also famous for its beautiful architecture and for one of the world's most famous bridges, the Golden Gate Bridge. The city has a population of about 800,000, and its residents have always had a reputation of tolerance towards alternative lifestyles. In the mid-1960s, San Francisco became famous around the world as the home of an alternative subculture, which was called the Hippie movement. The mid-1960s was a difficult period in the United States, and there were many demonstrations and protests across the country. The civil rights movement, which was led by Martin Luther King, was campaigning for racial equality and human rights. There was also a growing anti-war campaign. The USA had been fighting a war in Vietnam since 1959, and many Americans opposed this. But these demonstrations were often stopped by the police. Protests sometimes became violent when demonstrators tried to defend themselves, and people were shocked by this violence. Some young people shared similar attitudes towards this political situation. They became disillusioned and decided to rebel against authority and society. They developed a new subculture which identified itself as the hippie movement. Their ideology was linked with peace, freedom, and love. They opposed war and believed that money wasn't important. They believed that people should share each other's things. In the summer of 1967, over 100,000 hippies from around the world came to the Haight-Ashbury area of San Francisco to hang out together. It's somewhere which is still a popular tourist attraction today. Everything that hippies wore was usually brightly coloured. They often wore clothes that didn't match. Their look was very natural, and they didn't use lipstick or hair dye. They didn't have a special hairstyle, although sometimes they didn't cut their hair, so it grew very long. A man who had long hair was quite shocking at the time. Men also often had beards and moustaches. Both men and women sometimes wore flowers in their hair. Hippies didn't wear anything expensive like gold chains. Beads and flowers were worn as necklaces. Sometimes they painted flowers on each other's faces or had words written like peace and love. They enjoyed the freedom of travelling and often travelled together in vans that they painted themselves with bright colours and patterns. At this time, folk rock was very popular. A lot of hippie music was influenced by the sound of instruments from the Indian subcontinent, like the sitar. John Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono became symbols of the hippie movement in 1969, when they promoted peace from their hotel room in Amsterdam. Music, dancing and poetry were very important, and there were many outdoor festivals in the late 1960s. The most famous music festival was the Woodstock Festival, which was held in August 1969. Hundreds of thousands of people attended the 3-day event. By the 1970s, some aspects of hippie fashion and music had become part of the mainstream culture. Today, there are still groups of hippies around the world whose ideology is the same as the hippie ideology from the 1960s. Glastonbury, which is in the southwest of England, is a place where there are still some famous hippie communities. Although the hippie movement was unconventional when it began, a lot of today's mainstream culture has been influenced by elements of the hippie subculture. This influence can be seen in everything from shops, fashion, and annual music festivals to the environmental movement. The USA had been fighting a war in Vietnam since 1959, and many Americans opposed this. Their ideology was linked with peace, freedom, and love. John Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono became symbols of the hippie movement in 1969.